From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Coming up today, K-State's Dale Blasi will talk about the merits of a limit feeding program for backgrounder beef calves based on extensive research Dale has conducted on this approach. And we'll have highlights from the recent 100th edition of the Cattle Chat podcast from the Beef Cattle Institute at K-State. It featured panel responses to various listener questions about cow-calf management. Later, K-State's Jeff Whitworth checks in with a timely word to you alfalfa growers about controlling weevils and army cutworms before the expected cold weather rolls into Kansas in the coming days. And on this week's horticulture segment, the topic is lawn weed control with K-State's Ward Upham. All that right here on Agriculture Today.
Have you ever wondered why livestock producers burn Kansas pasture? Here's the deal. Controlled burning helps preserve the prairie and allows every bite feeder cattle eat to be the most nutritious. National Wildlife and Parks also feel it is a necessity to help with wildlife populations.
So the next time you see a Kansas pasture burning, know it's for the good of our wildlife, our prairie, and our livestock. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Agriculture Today is back now as we'll pass along research information out of the Animal Sciences and Industry Department at K-State that our guest now has been accumulating on the idea of limit feeding received calves, backgrounder calves, and why a producer might want to look at that alternative. Dale Blasi is a beef cattle specialist with K-State Research and Extension. Dale, you've invested a fair amount of research effort into this very concept, haven't you?
Yes, since 2016, we have conducted a numerous series of studies looking at various angles of this topic. The primary concept behind limit feeding is that you remove a substantial portion of roughage away from the diet of the calves. And that represents, as we've experienced in Kansas over the last 5-6 years, the consequences of drought in terms of short feed availability, high-priced roughage products, also having to deal with the hassles of grinding the material. It's a concept that really fits from the perspective of trying to get the most out of what you provide to a calf. And there's been a lot of research in the past conducted with limit feeding, mostly based upon a lot of cereal, starchy type grains comprising the majority of the diet. We took a different angle, and yes, we do use about 37 or so % corn in the diet, but we lean heavily on the highly digestible fiber that we find in our co-products, be it wet distillers grains or corn gluten feed, the wet corn gluten feed that we get out of Blair, Nebraska. And there's a lot of available energy through the digestible fiber in that co-product. So we're circumventing the overload, if you will, of the starch if we were to use the majority of grain in these limit feeding diets. One thing about limit feeding is we're not providing these high energy diets at ad libitum intake, meaning the calf has free choice to consume as much as it might wish to. We actually know exactly what the animal weighs on the get-go, on the beginning, and we're able to program that calf based upon limiting its intake. And in this case, we believe the sweet spot is around 2.2% of its body weight. And then we formulate the diet. The animal consumes its needs entirely in that 2.2% dry matter that it's allowed.
And in limit feeding, then, you're presenting that feed how often?
The feed is presented once a day. And our observations suggest that those bunks are stripped clean within 5 hours of presentation of the feed. So, for people that are busy in the farming or during the harvest times, feeding once a day and having a complete cleanup of the bunk lends a lot in terms of any leftover stale feed or feed that must be removed because of a rain or a snow event or what have you.
Well, then, Dale, you've been interested in a number of the effects of limit feeding calves, principally co-products as the main ingredient here. What factors have you really wanted to hone in on as far as the performance of this limit feeding diet?
Well, first of all, what we've determined so far, Eric, in our research is that we see an improvement in feed efficiency of about 28%.
That's significant.
That is substantially significant because every mouthful of feed that calf consumes is utilized. Now, with respect to limit feeding, one of the things that happens inside the digestive system of the animal when you limit feed is that the rate of passage of the feed goes through the tract at a much slower rate. And as a consequence, there's greater absorption and better utilization of the nutrients that are presented, post-ruminally into the small intestine and so forth. So for every mouthful of feed, that calf is getting more from the feed. So again, we got a 27% improvement in feed efficiency, and that's huge. The other aspects of limit feeding that we're studying at this present time is because we are limit feeding calves, it only makes sense that when you initially present the feed to the calves at the bunks, if a calf's not hungry at that time and it's holding back from wanting to come up to the bunk to eat, I think it does a much, much better job from a health perspective, from the health detection perspective. So if calves are only eating once a day and they have everything cleaned up within 5 hours, there's 19 hours that there's nothing in the bunk but water, of course, in the pen. So there's got to be a good reason why if a calf does not display any enthusiasm for wanting to approach the bunk upon the approach of the feed truck.
And therefore it allows you to identify that illness much more readily.
Correct. And so from an antimicrobial perspective, which is a big issue in our industry today, if we can do a better job of earlier detection of calves that are maybe not quite showing symptoms for whatever reason. So we're looking at that aspect. The other aspect, I'm collaborating this one particular project with Dr. Glenn Tonser and his graduate student. Dr. Tonser and his student are putting the economic numbers together so that we can have a total picture of, okay, when hay conditions or corn conditions, prices are at this level, here's what you can anticipate.
Intuitively, when you're talking of a 28% improvement in feed efficiency, when you compare the costs of limit feeding to, say, full feeding, well, there must be an advantage there on the limit feeding side, isn't there?
Absolutely. And again, it's all based upon what the prevailing corn prices are. I mean, right now, our wet distillers grains, our ethanol market is, there's plants that are shut down. And so the availability, all those things are always in a state of flux, right? But again, I mean, there's opportunities for our producers. You're looking at a potential advantage of about $20 to $25 per calf. And this is over a short receiving and a backgrounding. The other aspect about limit feeding is that if you're dead wintering calves, for example, prior to going to grass, and you want to limit their performance to a pound and a half, or however, you can look at the market window with respect to the value of gain. And again, I'll cite my colleagues over in Ag Econ with that piece of software they call Beef Basis. It's a website. You can look at future feeder prices and future corn and really get a good look out into the future to figure out the most timely week, if you will, you might wish to market your calves based upon the value of gain. So being able to utilize these formulas and formulate a diet to hit exactly where you want, you can program grow these calves to the rate which is best for you in the operation.
And one further facet on this, although you note, Dale, that you're still fleshing this angle out more through research, but the impact of limit feeding on that final carcass product. You have an interest in that too.
Well, it's very important. I mean, we're feeding a 60 NEG diet. Bear in mind, Eric, in the feedlot, they're feeding a 65-66 finish diet. So we're not very far below where a calf on the final phases of its production is at. And so in the back of our mind, we have concerns about, are we creating potential issues in the backgrounding phase by limit feeding? And is that having any negative implications on the performance and the carcass merit outcome of these cattle as they go through the finish phase? So we just wrapped up a study earlier this year following calves that we limit fed at the stocker unit and finished at a commercial feedlot. We have all that carcass merit information pulled together. I've had producers ask me, well, if you're limit feeding calves, you're restricting their intake, are you shrinking their gut, if you will? Are they going to be able to perform once they get into the feedlot? So while we see increased performance from limit feeding in the backgrounding phase, into the finish phase, those limit-fed cattle, they're basically catching up. But at the carcass merit, what we see raw numbers alone, and I only have the heavy set of cattle, we saw an improvement of about 5% in terms of the incidence of certified Angus beef rating. We did see a higher fraction of yield grade 3s and 4s in the 60 NEG fed calves during the backgrounding phase. But if you're a producer that limit feeds cattle and you retain ownership, I mean, we're going to be able to put together the whole picture. We'll be able to look at this from a system perspective of you may be gaining here, but you might be losing at another point.
That all said, though, it does seem that the approach of limit feeding has a potential for greater utilization in our industry. Is that your feeling, Dale?
Absolutely. And there's requirements for limit feeding, too. I mean, a mixer wagon, you got to do a good job with mixing your feed. I've had producers ask me if they could use grass traps and just limit. Well, that's not limit feeding. If the calf has access to grass, you're really not restricting intake on that calf. You might be able to carry more by providing some supplemental feed of whatever fashion, but it's not truly the sense of limit feeding. For backgrounders, this is a beautiful system. And by any means, look very hard at this feeding methodology for growing calves.
Well, Dale, your work has definitely refined the idea of limit feeding for those growing calves. Great input, and we appreciate you covering all of this. Many thanks to you.
Thank you for all you do, Eric.
Dale Blasi, beef cattle specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Again, they've accumulated quite a body of information on the performance of limit feeding programs for backgrounding received calves here at Kansas State University, and we'll be plugging away further on this research moving forward. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and we'll be back on the K-State Radio Network.
A social distancing tip.
Keeping your distance from others is important in slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are some fun things to do alone. Read a book, take a walk, unpack your suitcase from that trip you took last September, paint a self-portrait, catch up on a TV series, do a puzzle. Remember, we should all stay home to lower the risk for everyone. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Up for you now on Agriculture Today, highlights from another Cattle Chat podcast, a weekly conversation amongst the experts at the Beef Cattle Institute at K-State. Just so happens that this was the 100th edition of the series, so in recognition of that, the panel devoted the entire podcast to responding to listener questions on various aspects of cow-calf management. On board for this session, cow-calf specialist Bob Weaber, livestock economist Dustin Pendell, and veterinarians Bob Larson and Brad White as moderator.
This is a question from Minnesota. This is an interesting question, and a lot of people will face this. So, young producer, relatively small herd, AIs the cows and keeps heifers to continue to grow the herd. So he's building the herd growth-wise. Calves in the spring, wants to breed those heifers at 14 or 15 months of age so that they calve as a 2-year-old. The question comes down to, and I'll infer a little bit in because I think many of us face this challenge, you don't have a lot of separate pastures to put these cattle in. So he says, how long do I have to keep that replacement heifer separate before putting her back in the herd?
All right, so we winter calf in October. I would probably prefer to keep that cow really managed separately until she's well into her pregnancy for her second pregnancy.
Oh, wow. That's a long time, Bob.
It is a long time, but it's kind of like we've got a lot of expenses into these heifers. And the biggest risk I have for an animal to drop out of the herd is really after that first pregnancy. And I can't really afford to lose them that early. After I put this much money into them, I need them to get pregnant for their second pregnancy and really hold that through. And so that's why I say I should probably manage them separately until they're well into their second pregnancy. Now, I understand the problems of, a limited number of pastures, labor, those kinds of things. And so all I would say is that if you can put them in with the mature cows earlier, but you better monitor them and really watch those girls. And if forage is limited this year because of a drought or other situations, they would be the first ones to need some additional management.
Yeah, I agree, Bob. I think your point on those young females being the high-risk ones for fallout is dead on. And for a small producer, one of the strategies that I think makes a fair bit of sense is, at least for the post-weaning period until you get them bred, that may be some kind of confinement or small lot separate feeding, and actually do a pretty modest heifer development program. So you get those heifers to probably somewhere 65-70% of their mature weight, at least, by breeding time. And that'll help make sure those females are ready to breed. In a number of cases, it's fairly easy to do that with today's genetics. And so maybe even targeting something in the 75% of their body weight to give you a little insulation, so that if you do have to turn those females with the mature cows for the summer grazing period, they'll still gain weight and gain enough to be at a reasonable target for calving as a 2-year-old and a good body condition score, probably with some protein supplementation next winter. But take advantage of the time that you need them separated and get some groceries into those girls and get them developed along. And if you're a small producer, you're already not in the least cost sort of production mode anyway, and taking care of those females with a little extra feed probably makes some sense.
One thing I'll just add real quick, another thing before you decide to keep your replacement heifers, you might just look and pencil out the numbers and make sure that it makes sense to keep your own replacement heifers versus possibly going out into the market looking at buying replacement heifers.
That's a great strategy for small producers.
Great point. And especially with as long as it takes. So I agree, Bob, with your recommendation, and anything else is a compromise, right? So if I put them back into the herd sooner, I certainly could do that, but I'm compromising a little bit. Maybe outsourcing those heifers would be important. Next question, and I'm going to keep you guys moving because I want to get through as many of these as we can on today's show. Dustin, this question is to you, and it is, we did a podcast a few weeks ago on depreciation of cows, and the question was, how do I include that depreciation in a budget?
That's a good question. So I think if you go back, I believe that podcast was last fall. But first, you got to define what depreciation is. We define that as the purchase price or the replacement cost minus the salvage value divided by the productive years in the herd. And so thinking about this from a budget standpoint, or how do we incorporate that into a budget, I'd say there's probably a couple ways that people can do that or are doing that. We just talked about the producer raise their own replacement heifers. And so if they're doing that, they're going to be selling fewer calves in the following year. So it'd be on the revenue side. So that's one way they're thinking about that purchase price or that replacement cost. It's also probably showing up in the cash flow, possibly by purchasing. So if they're purchasing replacement heifers, they're purchasing those replacement heifers and selling fewer cows. And so if you purchase those replacement heifers, that's showing up in your income statement, your cash flow budget in the revenue side. You're either making more revenue or you're getting less revenue from selling fewer calves. The follow-up question to that we also received was, how are market trends important in thinking about depreciation? How is that showing up? The market trends are important because we talked about reducing the purchase price of replacement heifers and or trying to increase the salvage value of a cow. So you probably need to understand the cull cow markets and or the replacement heifer markets as well. So both of those show up in the numerator of a depreciation calculation. And so that's why you need to understand the market trends.
And so I think that's something that, based on your answer, there's quite a bit to that, and that may be a great example to reach out to an extension specialist, or there's some examples of budgets on Ag Manager info. Great place to learn how to check that depreciation. So we appreciated that question from Illinois. This question is actually from South Africa. Two parts of this question, and I'm going to ask the Bobs. What is the heritability of gestation length in beef cattle? And part two, could we just use bulls with a shorter gestation length to prevent dystocia? Thoughts? So great question. And gentlemen, evidence here now, we are worldwide, right? So we got listeners in South Africa. That's phenomenal. That's really cool. The gestation length actually turns out to be a really key component in our understanding of calving ease and dystocia events in beef cattle. And in fact, a number of the genetic evaluation systems here in the U.S. at one point of time or another have used gestation length as one of the trait components in the calving ease genetic evaluation. So the things they looked at were calving ease scores, birth weights, and gestation length records from known AI mating. So we have a good solid number for the days of gestation. And it turns out the heritability of gestation length ranges a little bit in the literature, typically from somewhere in the mid-0.2s, upward of Simmental, for example. A couple of literature estimates suggest in the mid to upper 0.3s. So about the same as weaning weight really is a good way to describe it. And it has a correlated genetic response with obviously birth weight, so the shorter the gestation, typically the lighter the birth weight, and then a positive relationship with calving ease, or the percentage of calves born unassisted. So Bob, would you say that's, let me interrupt for a second. I want to ask for a clarification. So a 0.2, similar to weaning weight, would you put that as highly heritable, lowly heritable, or somewhere in the middle? Moderately heritable. Moderately heritable. Yep. Okay, yep. In the middle.
So to kind of address the questioner asked was, could we use pregnancy length or gestation length? And actually we probably are. When we're using lower birth weight bulls or higher calving ease bulls, they probably really are bulls that have a shorter gestation, or their calves have a shorter length of pregnancy.
Especially if they have a good weaning weight.
Yeah.
Right? Low birth weight, good weaning weight, may just be a gestation length.
Yeah, right, exactly. Now, that ties into, can you go too far? And I'm suspicious that I've seen some herds that could possibly go too far with that, as far as selecting really low birth weight, think of it as short pregnancy length or short gestation length, generation after generation, to the point where some of those calves in the herd have a really short gestation. And so now you're starting to talk about almost a premature or really early birth, which leads into calf being able to thrive at birth and those types of things, and being born too small. So yes, one of the ways we manage calving difficulty is to select bulls that have shorter length of gestation, or the calves are born just a little bit earlier, but you can take that too far.
Yep, for sure. And I think, we see a little bit of that, I know, in our purebred beef unit here at K-State, when we use really high calving ease bulls. Those heifers calve typically a week or 10 days early. Sometimes those calves come out and they're little 50-pounders. And so you're exactly right, I think, Bob, that we can take that a little too far. And I think maybe one of the potential solutions to that is sort of helping breeders understand the antagonism here, that you can take it too far, and actually selecting for animals that are high calving ease or acceptable calving ease, but are reasonable in terms of gestation length, may actually help us a lot in those calf survival issues. Great listener question. Thanks for sending that from South Africa. That's awesome.
Those were just a few of the questions that K-State's Brad White, Bob Weber, Bob Larson, and Dustin Pendell addressed in the 100th BCI Cattle Chat podcast. It's posted in its entirety for your listening at beefcattleinsitute.org. We'll return with more on Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
We're back now on Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. We have invited back in with a time-sensitive message for you alfalfa growers now. Crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth of K-State Research and Extension. He's visited with us a couple of times, in fact, about worries over alfalfa weevils and army cutworms in alfalfa stands out there. And he tells us he is yet deluged with calls from alfalfa growers about contending with these pests, and And Jeff, you say you want to pass along an advisory to alfalfa producers about responding to those.
Well, good morning, Eric. As you know, we've had some really warm weather in the last, 4 or 5 days. The Army cutworms, they've been feeding pretty voraciously since last fall, but now they're getting pretty large. So a lot of the alfalfa growers are starting to notice them because of bare spots in the alfalfa. Plus, not having a lot of moisture recently is not helping that situation. The nice thing about Army cutworms, again, they only feed above ground, so hopefully they're not destroying the root system. But I have gotten a lot of calls, and I've seen several places where the Army cutworms have fed enough that there's no more host plant material, and they're moving, and they move en masse. And I've gotten several calls about that. And a lot of the guys are wondering if they're going someplace to pupate. No, they're not. They're going someplace else where there's new tissue to feed on because they've exhausted the supply where they have been. So some of the guys have sprayed for Army cutworms, and some of the guys are contemplating spraying for Army cutworms. Well, now we're also starting to see a pretty good hatch of alfalfa weevils. The 70 to 80 degree weather, they're hatching like crazy. And a lot of guys are calling, wondering about spraying with the advent of the predicted cold spell. As you know, insecticides don't work as well below 50 degrees. They still work, but they don't work as well, mainly because the insects are not as active. These are contact insecticides, so the insects just don't get into contact with them as much as they do when it's warmer. But they still work. But the question I've been getting is, should I treat now or should I wait? The thing is, alfalfa weevils, as are the Army cutworms, are cool weather insects, so they're going to feed anytime the temperature's 45 degrees or above. And they'll feed 24/7 as long as those temperatures are 45, 48 degrees and above. And also, another question I've been getting, if you spray once, will it control both Army cutworms and alfalfa weevil larvae? And we did put out one trial probably 10 or 15 years ago where both occurred at the same time, the alfalfa weevil and the Army cutworm, and we got pretty good control. One of the things you need to remember when you spray, these Army cutworms are getting pretty big and they're pretty tough, but the treatment that I've seen, it knocks them down. But when it's cool, it doesn't necessarily kill them. They're morebound, which means they're not going to feed, but they'll still wiggle a little bit. And a lot of the guys are saying, look, the insecticide didn't work, but they're not feeding. And I've seen them in the past be on the ground without actually being dead, but not feeding for like a week during cool weather. So don't get too excited if you spray. And I would go ahead and spray. If my field reached treatment threshold now, and a lot of them are just doing that, and that treatment threshold for the alfalfa weevil is 1 per 2 or 1 per 3 stems. So a 33 or a 50% infestation level triggers treatment for a lot of folks. Everybody has a little bit different because they use alfalfa a little bit differently, but that's generally if you have a 50% infestation level with small larvae, that is going to trigger a treatment. The cold weather won't kill eggs. There's going to be more alfalfa weevil larvae eggs hatch, but it will kill the larvae. The overwintering stage is the egg stage or the adult stage. But if we get temperatures down into the mid-20s for a couple of hours like we had back in 2018, it will kill some of these larvae. But from what I've seen, it didn't look like the temperatures were going to get that cold. So if I had the opportunity, I would go ahead and treat when my fields reach treatment threshold for alfalfa weevils, and it will take care of the Army cutworms.
All right, Jeff, thanks for the summary, and once again, we'll touch base soon.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Eric.
That updated word for you alfalfa growers. From crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth, K-State Research and Extension. Next up on Agriculture Today, Greg Akagi with this week's Kansas soybean update. Greg?
Dan O'Brien, K-State Extension Associate Professor in Ag Economics, joins us. And Dan, the Plantings Intentions Report came out in late March. How are we looking as far as what we could see for the soybean crop this year?
There's a U.S. story and there's a Kansas level story. For the U.S. story, projection is for 83.5 million acres to be planted here in the U.S. That's a rebound from last year. We did a lot of preventive planting, delayed in the field issues that happened all throughout the spring, and we were down to 76.1 million acres. So that rebound, part of that's expected just because we're not anticipating the same prevented planted numbers. In the state of Kansas, we're projected to be 5 million acres for 2020 plantings, and that's up from about 4.5 million in 2019, and actually even up from about 4.75 in 2018. I think that the happenings in the U.S. corn market and ethanol, the last since this survey was taken in early March, very likely could lead to the U.S. and the Kansas numbers to move even higher, particularly the U.S. numbers as you look to the eastern and northern corn belt. Actually, it's surprising in the midst of all this uncertainty that's come into the markets because of the coronavirus that prices have held up as well as they have. In eastern and central Kansas, you have cash prices at the beginning of March that were at $8.28 a bushel. Now they're $8.36 here in recent days. So they haven't really fallen off in the eastern part of the state that much. And in the western part, we have seen some decline about 40, 50 cents from about $8.11 down to $7.61. Futures were at $9.01 in early March, or just around $9 here, closed at about $8.55, $8.56 as we look at April the 2nd. So we have seen some decline there. I think that's really in concert with the general concerns that have happened in the markets of late. Prospects for 2020, I do wonder about uncertainty that's still to be dealt with in the logistical chains of our South American export competitors, particularly Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay also. And I would not be surprised that there could be opportunities for the U.S. to perform well in export markets to maintain our prices here in the U.S. all that much stronger if there are logistical disruptions that happen in our competitors' supply chains to the south. And if when those come, they would be a surprise and would be kind of a shock to the market. So we're holding it at prices at or above cost of production right now for soybeans, and have the possibility of moving even higher if we get some positive surprises on the U.S. side anyway that could come through the export market.
That's Dan O'Brien, K-State Extension Associate Professor in Ag Economics, who joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Many thanks, Greg. And you're listening to Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so if you have a fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going in. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Next for you now on Agriculture Today, this week's K-State Horticulture segment. Loads of questions on the minds of homeowners right now about controlling those now emerging weeds in their home lawns. So guidance on that from our guest now via video conference, Ward Upham, horticulturist with K-State Research and Extension. Well, Ward, they're quite evident, a number of these weeds already, starting with winter annuals, henbit being principal among those, you say.
That's right. So henbit's number one, but you can also have chickweed, speedwell, shepherd's purse. There are a number of those. But henbit's the one with the little purple flowers. And so that's the one that really shows up, and that's the one people really want to get rid of. However, when they are this mature, it is very, very difficult to control them. You know, we want a selective herbicide, doesn't hurt the grass, but does get the weed. Usually what we use are going to be combination herbicides that are for dandelions and other winter annual weeds such as this. But at this time of year, often they just maybe knock the henbit back a little bit and then it comes back. However, since henbit and these others are winter annuals, they are going to die once it gets hot. And so probably the best thing to do at this time of year, just keep them mowed and then wait for them to die. And then also what you want to do is mark on your calendar in early November to spray for these weeds. They're winter annuals, which means they come up usually sometime in October, spend the winter as a small weed, and then they really make themselves known in the spring. So number of things you can use in the fall. You could use just straight 2,4-D. You could use Trimec, Weed Be Gone, Weed Out, any of those herbicides that are made to kill broadleaf weeds in lawns. They'll do an excellent job in early November. They won't do a very good job now. So the other thing is dandelions. Right. You know, dandelions are perennial. We also have a bunch of new ones come up in the fall, a little bit earlier than the winter annuals, but they still would be young plants now. Spraying them at this time of year, sometimes you get really good control, sometimes you don't. So if you want to try to control them, that's fine. But spraying them in the fall, whenever you spray those winter annuals, you're going to get the dandelions too. And so spraying in the fall will take care of both the dandelions and the winter annuals. And so that's really the time to spray.
If one chooses, though, to spot spray dandelions, if they're particularly thick and intolerable, then what kind of product would one want to opt for at this time of the year?
So you want to use a combination product. So it's going to be something that has 2,4-D, MCBP, and dicamba. Especially that 2,4-D is important. But a lot of our common weed control products have those three in them. As I mentioned, Weed Be Gone, Weed Out, Trimec, all of those are combination products that would work. They give you the best chances anything to get rid of those weeds. Weed Free Zone and Speed Zone, another couple that would also work well.
All right. Next up then on the hit list, if you will, crabgrass, which is making itself known out there as well in our home lawns. So what are the recommended tactics for getting after it, Ward?
Crabgrass is a summer annual, means it comes up in the spring and it dies in the fall with the first frost. Therefore, what we normally use on it is going to be a pre-emergence herbicide. What that means is that it kills that weed seed as it germinates. Most of these do not kill the weed after it's already up. There is one exception, but most of them do not. So we have to get it on before the crabgrass comes up. And we're still have enough time to get a crabgrass preventer in and get it activated so that we can get good control. One of the things to remember is crabgrass seed needs light to germinate. If it doesn't have light, it's not going to germinate. Therefore, if you have a good thick lawn, you're probably not going to have much trouble with crabgrass. A lot of people may have a good thick lawn over most of that area except in the parkway. That's that area between the sidewalk and the street where it gets hotter and drier than normal and often it kind of thins out. Therefore, you could, if you wanted to, just put a crabgrass preventer in that area in order to control the crabgrass. However, if you do that, you have to use a crabgrass preventer that does not have fertilizer on it. If it has fertilizer, you can get these dark green bands, and it's going to really stick out against the rest of that lawn. And so the way to get one without fertilizer is to go into a garden center or hardware store and ask for that. There's not very many out there, but there are some. You'll be able to find them, and you can apply that. It's really a little bit too early to fertilize anyway. You want to be fertilizing usually in early May and use a slow-release fertilizer then. And so if we can do those two things, get after the winter annuals in the fall and then the crabgrass in the spring, we can go a long way to having a weed-free lawn.
And as far as those preventive products go, their efficacy is pretty well uniform across product lines then?
They are. There's two that will last the whole season. There's one with Dimension. The common chemical name is dithiopyr, and another called Barricade, and it's the common chemical name for that is prodiamine. Those will last the entire season. If you use one that has pendimethalin, such as Scott's Halts, it's going to take two applications. One now and then another in about 6 weeks. And those three are the big ones. They're the ones that most people are going to buy. And of those three, Dimension is by far the most common. And so the nice thing about it is that it does not stain sidewalks like those other two do. And also it does have some activity on crabgrass that's already come up. So it'll kill young crabgrass, maybe 2 to 3 leaf stage. After that, it doesn't. But if you're on the lawn a little bit later than you'd like to be, a product with Dimension is the one you want.
All right. And with any of these products you stress, it's important for the homeowner to water these in for full efficacy.
That's right. They do need to be watered in, and it doesn't take much, maybe 1/4 of an inch of water, and that's all they need. They will wait for water, like Dimension will wait up to 30 days. Now, if you have a moist lawn, you may want to water it in before then, just because you could have that crabgrass germinate while you're waiting for a rain or irrigation. The other thing to keep in mind is with those broadleaf weed killers, for the henbit, chickweed, dandelion, all that type of stuff, you don't want water within 24 hours. It can actually reduce efficacy. So on crabgrass, you have to have it. And on broadleaf herbicides, you don't.
got to keep that straight. But these are pretty straightforward guidelines, if you will, on dealing with weeds as we get into the growing season in earnest now in our home lawns. Of course, you can check with your local garden center for more information as you shop for the products that you will employ for this purpose. And Ward, thank you as always. We will touch base with you again very soon.
Thanks.
That's Ward Upham. Ward is a horticulturist with K-State Research and Extension on this week's Horticulture segment. And our thanks to you for tuning in. Eric Atkinson bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.